So in this session, we're going to be looking at some more theoretical perspectives in addiction, which continue to think about and understand addiction as an issue of impulse and or self-control. And specifically, we're going to begin the session thinking about self-regulation from a normative perspective. So what do we actually mean by self-regulation? What does it mean to self-regulate your behaviour? And then think about how that's relevant to addiction. And as with previous sessions, it's really important to understand that many of the processes that we're discussing from a psychological perspective in the context of addictive behaviour are behaviours and processes which are completely normative. That reward pathways would be a good example. The reward pathways are not a pathological process. They are one of the very important ways in which human beings learn. We're then going to move on to look at a specific piece of work in the addictions field that's been very influential in our understanding about some of the issues that we observe, some of the behaviours that we observe amongst people with problems of addiction, which is impulse control and the apparent loss of control, as is often described. And within that, we'll be looking specifically at something called inhibitory dysregulation theory. The second half of the session is then going to be focused more on the notion of disease. And first of all, thinking about whether or not it makes sense to think of addiction as a disease, which will involve a discussion about the nature of what it means for something to be a disease in general terms. And then we'll move on to a brief discussion of the brain disease model of addiction and the strengths and limitations of that particular approach, which is a very important model in the addictions field, albeit one that's strongly contested by a number of people. So, self-regulation. In broad terms, there are some questions here that I want to sort of pose. And the first is addiction fundamentally a failure to control yourself? From an objective perspective, would it make sense to say that a person who has problems with addiction, who develops an addictive behaviour, is fundamentally, for some reason and at some level, failing to control their behaviour? The notion of loss of control, this phenomenon is often used to describe, individuals will talk about feeling as though they lost control of their behaviour and talking about being unable to control their behaviour. So it would seem on the face of it that this concept of self-regulation and loss of control is really important in our understanding of addictive behaviour. Certainly it's something we need to explain if we're able to, or looking to offer a coherent account of what addictive behaviour is. Why is it that people, even subjectively, feel that they cannot control their behaviour very easily? What do we mean by that? Given that chronic drug use is known to affect brain regions, what are the implications of this for a disease model? This is something we'll come on to in the latter part of this session. Ultimately, whether we think addiction is a disease or not, we do know that the use of drugs has a particular impact on the brain, and different drugs have different impacts on different parts of the brain. But many of those brain regions that are affected by chronic long-term drug use are the regions associated with our ability to exercise control and particularly inhibit behaviours or exercise impulse control. And we'll also think about, from a cognitive perspective now, what sorts of ideas might help us at this impasse. So, do we really want to say that a person who has a problem with addiction has actually lost control? They are actually unable to control their behaviour. It may seem to the individual that that's what happens, and it may seem from an outsider's perspective that that's what's happened. But then how do we account for things like spontaneous recovery? How do we account for the fact that people manage to overcome their addiction? The majority of people do at some point manage to overcome their addiction. So if you've lost control over the behaviour, then what is it we're actually saying if at some point you regain control? Is it a weakening of control, a diminishing of control? What's actually going on? But let's first think from a psychological perspective about self-regulation in general. What do we mean when we talk about self-regulation or exercising control over our behaviour? The first important distinction to draw, and it's one that's often overlooked when we talk about impulse control or self-regulation in more general terms, is that the control of your behaviour isn't just about stopping yourself from doing things or exercising impulse control or inhibiting inappropriate responses, or indeed any responses. An example here of inhibiting an inappropriate response might be, for example, stopping yourself from laughing when you're told about an embarrassing incident which your friend clearly finds distressing. It's a marker of potentially how good a friend you are, but that would be a good example of what inhibiting a response looks like. Something that you feel an urge to do, but you stop yourself from doing it. But the other side of the coin, and actually different brain regions subserve these different activities, is the activation of responses. So self-regulation isn't just about stopping yourself from doing something, it's also about actually making yourself do things. And particularly the sort of the more effortful types of activatory response would be making yourself do things that you perhaps don't feel a strong urge to do. So if it's a particularly cold morning, maybe the heating didn't come on in the morning, you're nice and warm tucked up in bed, you know you need to get into work or get to university for a class, and you don't want to get out of bed, and you make yourself do it. You have to exercise this Herculean effort to force yourself, especially if, like me, you're not a morning person. You have to exercise this willful act of control over your behaviour to make yourself do something that you don't want to do. Now, I mentioned just then that actually there are different brain regions that underpin our ability to both inhibit responses as well as activate responses, and that's quite important in terms of then understanding the impact of drugs, alcohol and other forms of addictive behaviours. But the key thing here is just to keep this in mind, that the loss of control phenomenon is often construed in addiction as really only being about inhibition. But if you think about what addiction really looks like in practice for a person who is maintaining an addictive behaviour over a period of time, there's actually a huge amount that goes on in terms of making yourself do things, activating responses, engaging in planning, engaging in, in many cases people will talk about in recovery stories having hidden their addiction from other people because they didn't want to be judged or didn't want somebody to, make them feel uncomfortable by talking to them about it. They may have been in denial or whatever that is. And the key thing there is that actually that stops looking so much quite like somebody who's completely lost control. What seems to happen is that control of the use behaviour, using drugs, drinking alcohol, seems to be unrestrained, seems to be very impulsive, and people engaging in the behaviour again and again. But actually what's required in order to maintain that behaviour may well be a series of very effortful actions in order to, whether it's to find money or resources in order to be able to purchase, or whether it's thinking about how to disguise your problem from somebody that you're very close to, who, all of these things require effort. They're not things that are indicative of someone who has completely lost control. And so that's quite an important concept that I just wanted to reinforce from the start, that self-regulation isn't just about making yourself not do things, it's also about making yourself do things, activating responses. The other important thing is, of course, that self-regulatory control is not something that is consistent across time or indeed across situations. So as I described just then, that for somebody who has a problem with alcohol, for example, they may find that their use of alcohol is something over which they have lost control. They may report an experience of a loss of control. Their use may become very compulsive. They may find it hard to stop if they have a drink and that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean to say that in all areas of their life that individual will have lost control. They cannot exercise restraint over impulsive urges that they may experience. And so it is important to keep that in mind as well, that self-regulatory capacity is what we think may be domain specific. It's not something that is consistent for every single type of behaviour. Now, Baumeister in 2003 actually did a review of this particular area because he was interested in how we constructed in psychological research the notion of self-regulation. It's this concept that you hear the idea of self-regulation, kind of makes intuitive sense what it means, but actually back in 2003 what Baumeister identified was that there was a lack of clarity about exactly what we meant by it. What's the mechanism that sits behind self-regulation? What do we actually think it is as a psychological process? And in a review of the literature and research on self-regulation in general, Baumeister identified 3 potential models of self-regulation, which I'll explain in just a moment: energy, cognitive and skill models. And when I say identified, what I mean is that in reviewing the literature, Baumeister identified that different researchers were talking about self-regulation in slightly different ways, that their interpretation of what self-regulation was slightly different, and it seemed to fall into these 3 broad categories of energy, cognitive and skill. So to define what these 3 categories are, the energy model of self-regulation suggests that self-regulation is a mental resource, and it's something that can be exhausted, that it's comparable to a muscle. So it's something that you can exercise in a short space of time, and it's something that within that short period of time can run out. The cognitive model of self-regulation argued that rather than being a kind of a mental resource, that we should think of self-regulation as a cognitive process which can be more or less active in time. So it's effectively something that you can do cognitively, and that you may or may not do it at certain points in time. And so if a person is demonstrating a loss of control, the implication is that actually all that's happening there is that they are not activating this cognitive process to exercise control. Whereas the skill model argued that self-regulation is something that we learn and that we can become better at over time. So importantly, if you think about these three different perspectives from the point of view of addiction, and thinking about, say, for example, a person failing to exercise restraint over their alcohol use or drug use, from an energy model perspective, the argument would be that the reason they've not done that they haven't exercised that control, is that they've depleted or exhausted this mental resource to be able to exercise control over their drinking. The cognitive model would argue that actually it's simply the case that they haven't attempted to, almost, that the cognitive process required in order to exercise control is simply not active, but that they could if they wanted to. And the skill model, on the other hand, would suggest that maybe this is something that they've just not done, that they've not exercised restraint, that their drinking has always been something over which they've never exercised it or attempted to exercise control. And so while this individual could demonstrate a high level of self-regulatory control in other areas of their life, if a person isn't exercising control over their drinking, the skill model would argue that it's simply because they've never done it before. They haven't learned how to do that. And so what Baumeister in this review of the literature was looking to do is to identify actually which of these three models is supported by the evidence, which of them has the support of the empirical evidence that's out there. What he concluded was that the evidence supports the existence of the energy model. The problem for the cognitive model is that it predicts no exhaustion in capacity. If it's simply something that you can do as a cognitive process in almost an automatic fashion, then it shouldn't be something that you can exhaust. But the evidence doesn't support this. When you look at the evidence, there's actually plenty of evidence consistent with what the energy model would argue, that people can exhaust in a short period of time or in a constrained period of time. They can exhaust their self-regulatory capacity. So if you engage in an effortful task doing one thing, then immediately after, your ability to exercise self-regulatory control on another task becomes diminished. It can recover, and it will recover over time, but in that particular point in time, you exhaust that energy. The skill model would predict no change in capacity between consecutive tasks. So if it's a skill, if self-regulatory control is a skill, if I ask you to engage in one behaviour that requires you to exercise self-regulatory control, and then I ask you to do something completely different that requires self-regulatory control, then there should be no change in your capacity between those two things. But again, the evidence doesn't suggest that. The evidence suggests that it is a form of energy, that it's something that in a particular period of time you can exhaust your self-regulatory control, and when you do, that will limit your ability to be able to exercise control in other tasks, even if they're completely different. I'll come to the Masacampo and Baumeister study in just a moment, but just to reflect briefly on the relevance of this for understanding addictive behaviour, and particularly mechanisms like relapse. So if we're saying that self-regulatory control, that the evidence supports this being a form of energy, effectively something that you can deplete in a period of time, and that will impact on your ability to do other things, we can look to very commonly understood things in the addictions field, like relapse and the risks around relapse. When you're going through recovery, it's an extremely effortful thing to do. It's not something that you can do mindlessly. It's not something that you can do accidentally. People who are going through recovery are having to pay attention to their behaviour, to engage in acts of self-reflection, whether that's through psychosocial therapy or any other type of support, and looking at making quite big changes to their lives in many cases. So when you're in recovery, you may be looking at changing your sort of social circle. You may be looking at all sorts of changes in the way that you live your life. And so a lot of effort is required to actually go through recovery. And we also know separately that people who are earlier on in their recovery, and particularly when you're early on in your recovery, if something goes wrong, if you experience a major life event, a bereavement, a serious illness, loss of a job, even things like moving house, that those are factors which put people at risk of relapse. And it's particularly common for people early on in their recovery journey. So if you think about this idea of energy or self-regulation being a form of energy, that actually helps to make sense of that process, doesn't it? Because just think for a moment, if you're exercising this sort of willful self-control, it will physically be tiring. You'll physically become tired when you're constantly having to monitor your own behaviour, to keep making these changes, to maintain these changes, and to deal with challenging situations that may come up in relation to an attempt at abstinence. And then all of a sudden something goes on in your life that is a major life event. What are major life events if they are not things that just take up all of your energy? That's why they're major life events. Things that go on in your life which require you to stop, to take stock, to think about how to deal with them. If you're moving house or changing jobs or worrying about money, whatever it may be, when those things happen, the reason they are major life events is because they distract our attention. And if we've only got a limited amount of energy, of mental energy, in order to be able to control our behaviour, then it's, when you look at it from that perspective, no wonder that relapse rates will be much higher if people have these sorts of experiences, particularly early on when they're attempting a period of abstinence or recovery. So this is a useful kind of psychological framework, I guess, for understanding the process of addiction and thinking about it through the lens of it being an act of control, an act of self-regulation. Trying to overcome an addiction is an act of self-regulation, but that's not something that can be completely isolated from the rest of one's life. Now, to come on to the paper by Masacampo and Baumeister, and there have been lots of papers looking at this particular thing. One of the things that after this review in 2003, Baumeister and colleagues were interested in understanding, if it is an energy, if we think self-regulatory control is a form of energy, what energy is it? Is it a kind of an ethereal, non-specific kind of psychological, psycho-spiritual energy, or what exactly are we talking about? Well, the evidence from this study and several others, and actually now as we build our understanding of the neuroscientific and neurological processes that sit behind the exercise of things like self-regulatory and inhibitory control, it's glucose, it's sweets. Not sweets, there are other forms of glucose available, such as from fruit, but nonetheless, the point is your brain uses glucose. It uses a lot of glucose. A lot of the glucose that's in your blood will be used by your brain. It's the main source of energy for the brain. So for all of the mental processes, the thinking that goes on in your head, your brain is burning glucose. And in this particular study, Masacampo and Baumeister conducted an experiment looking to see whether or not, using something called an attraction task, which is a form of self-regulatory control task, and there are lots of different versions of these sorts of things, essentially looked at whether or not when individuals are asked to engage in this act of self-regulatory control, would they in a subsequent task demonstrate a depletion of self-regulatory control. And that's exactly what they found, unless they were given a sugary drink in between. Another study that's in this area has shown that you can actually measure, just using a simple pinprick blood test of somebody, so for example checking their blood sugar levels for conditions like diabetes, home monitors of that kind, you can actually detect a drop in blood glucose levels when a person has engaged in efforts of self-regulatory control. It's the reason why when you're studying you feel exhausted, you might crave sugary foods. When you're engaging in non-physical but psychological, mental forms of self-regulatory control, making yourself pay attention, focusing on writing an essay, trying to overcome an addiction, you're exercising self-control and you're burning energy. The energy that you're burning is glucose. And so what they were demonstrating in this study is that actually one of the ways in which you can help to replenish that energy is to feed your body glucose. Now in this particular study they were using sugary drinks, but of course again if you start thinking about some of the other things that we know about recovery, that recovery from addictions or mental health more generally and other sorts of even physical health problems, we also know that trying to live a healthier life can be a positive way of improving recovery outcomes. So that will include eating a more healthy, balanced diet. Now, eating a more healthy, balanced diet has all of its benefits, but one of the other reasons that it has a benefit is that if you're eating, slow-release foods that have kind of slow-release sugars, rather than just eating lots of really sugary stuff that gives you a big spike and then a quick dip, by maintaining a healthier diet, you're maintaining the resources available to your body. When we become run down, when we risk burning ourselves out, it's because we're going through periods where we're not exercising self-care. And that self-care relates to, to this psychological aspect of ourselves as well. Recognising that in our lives, whatever we're trying to do, we need to self-regulate all the time. But in order to do that, we can't do it with an empty fuel tank. Our body needs feeding, it needs looking after. And so this area of work looking at self-regulation is really important more generally for understanding good sort of health and well-being practices, why things like exercise and good diet are so important. But it's also really insightful in terms of understanding the processes of addiction, where people may find themselves in a position where, because of the physical tolerance and withdrawal that they develop, the physical and psychological dependence to a drug, when that happens, it's going to take a really strong, effortful, forceful act of self-regulatory control in order to help yourself recover in the longer term. And that will happen. That will take a long while to happen. It doesn't just happen immediately. For many people, it will be a long journey through recovery. So through that period of recovery, looking after yourself in that sort of broad sense is really important. It's not really important just for sort of spiritual reasons or for sort of broad, non-specific health and well-being reasons. It's important because this act of self-regulatory control requires energy. It will burn through energy like no one's business, and so it's really important to understand that this is a process that sits behind things like recovery in the context of addiction. There's a quote here from Baumeister's 2003 paper, which I'll read out because I think it's quite important in terms of thinking through this application to addiction. Baumeister said, "The implication is that one important path into substance abuse and addiction is through ego depletion." Ego depletion is what Baumeister terms, or a phrase that he coined, to refer to this idea of depleting self-regulatory control, the depletion of ego, the depletion of your ability to exercise control. When the self's resources have been expended in other tasks, people have less left over to control their impulsive and appetitive behaviours. Learning more about how to maintain, increase and replenish this resource may therefore hold one promising key to helping people avoid addiction. And I'd say beyond just avoid, possibly also be relevant to helping people in recovery, and thinking through some of the clinical interventions and things that happen through peer support and so on and so forth. Actually, again, this is an interesting area of science where you find that the practices that have developed around trying to work with individuals on issues like self-care and making sure that they are feeding themselves properly, that they are trying to take exercise and so on, are things that people in a clinical context will have been doing for a long while when helping people with both mental health issues as well as supporting individuals with problems of addiction. And so it's really interesting to see this kind of parallel between the scientific work as we uncover more about our understanding of these underlying psychological mechanisms, and then the clinical things that have been happening, because intuitively people have come to understand through their experience that you can't just force yourself to not be addicted anymore. It's not as simple as that. It requires a more considered and structured approach, which involves taking care of yourself. So that's self-regulation. I want to come on to now this particular theory and idea of inhibitory dysregulation. And I mentioned this earlier, that there's this impact of using drugs over a period of time, this chronic use of drugs over time that has a particular impact on the brain. And it has a particular impact on the brain, and certain drugs in particular, which I'll mention in a moment, a particular impact on our ability to exercise impulse control. So this is the stopping oneself from doing things aspect of self-regulation, not the activatory responses, but the inhibitory responses. So in a review paper in 2004, Lubman and colleagues were looking at the evidence to understand the effects of drugs on the brain. And what they found in their review was consistent evidence that the chronic use of drugs leads to damage in the parts of the brain that are associated with inhibiting responses to rewarding behaviours. So we've discussed previously in sessions on learning theory the reward pathways and the important role they play in learning, and also the fact that the reward pathways, as I've already said, are not a pathological part of the brain. They're an important part of the way in which we learn to adapt in our environment, that we are more likely to pursue behaviours which in the past have produced rewards. In general, a really sensible thing, unless those rewards have long-term harms, as would be the case for many forms of addictive behaviour. And so there are regions of the brain that can be used to suppress these responses, these impulsive urges to engage or compulsions to engage in behaviours which have previously been rewarded. So essentially what Lubman and colleagues were identifying and pointing towards is this idea that over the period of time in which a person is using drugs in particular, and particularly drugs like psychostimulants that have this particular or particularly strong effect, over a period of time of using drugs, what happens is that your ability to suppress these impulsive urges to do behaviours that have previously been rewarded is diminished. It's diminished in a physiological sense, in a neurological sense. There is this particular diminishing. The important thing here, though, is that we're not talking about a loss of control in the sense of a complete loss. Very often when we talk about addiction and we talk about loss of control, it's pitched in these binary terms, that it's the loss of control, that phrase, which is very commonly used. The phrase loss of control suggests something very definite, very final, that you've lost control over your behaviour. Actually, if you look at the evidence that Lubman and colleagues have reviewed and other research in this area, what you find is it's a diminishing, it's a reduction. It's not a complete loss, it's not an absence of control. It's for people who have been using drugs for a long period of time, and of course the longer you use, the more of an impairment there'll be. It's a reduction in your ability to exercise control, and specifically and importantly, control over these behaviours that in the past have produced reward. Which is of course very important to understand from an addictions perspective, because the things to which people become addicted are very often the things, almost exclusively the things, which produce some form of reward. So the consequence of this is that decision making is impaired, because these impulsive responses, these urges, these compulsions that you may experience to engage in a particular behaviour cannot be easily overridden. Now it's important that that phrase, that word easily, it's not saying that you cannot override those behaviours, you cannot exercise inhibitory control. It's that over a period of time, over a long enough period of time, it will become harder and harder to do that. There's evidence from neuroimaging that's summarised in the Lubman et al. Paper. But it's also, I think, this idea of people and the reasons why relapse happened. There was this work by Miller and Gold back in the 70s, looking at the reasons that people report for why they relapse. Now, we often think of, in the context of addiction, we often think of craving as having this really central role. And in the previous session on impulse and self-control theories, we spoke about some of the other models of craving, particularly Tiffany's work looking at craving as a potentially automatic and non-conscious process in certain contexts. But strong craving was in this particular study very rarely reported by people as the reason for a relapse. People didn't often say the reason I relapsed is that I was kind of gagging for a drink, that I really wanted to smoke or use drugs. More often, people were reporting that the reason for a relapse was because of just a feeling of impulsiveness, that they were just impulsive, that it was almost that the reason that it happened is that I stopped stopping myself. And so there are various phrases and experiences like this used, where people often talk, the phrase is used in Alcoholics Anonymous, this idea of one drink, one drunk, which is describing an experience of many people, which is after a period of abstinence, people decide to sort of test themselves and think, well, can I have one? And for some people, some controlled use is possible, but it needs to be done carefully and under supervision. But for many people, if they kind of lead themselves to think that they're going to be okay, they have one drink, and that one drink activates the compulsion to do it again. And very often in recovery stories, you'll read people talking about or hear people talking about experiences where they kind of don't almost know what happened between drink number 1 and drink number 12. The next thing they knew almost was that they'd had too much. And so this idea of just becoming impulsive, or to look at it from another perspective, to have stopped exercising effortful control to not do the behaviour, is a much more common reason for people to report a relapse occurrence, as opposed to simply saying, I had this really strong urge, I wanted it, I was subjectively craving it, I was imagining having a drink, and eventually I couldn't stop myself. More often than not, people, or certainly more often than craving, people report this sort of impulsivity. They just became impulsive, they stopped stopping themselves. This is also consistent, this work around the effect of drugs and alcohol on the brain. This idea of poor future time perspective for people who have been using drugs or alcohol for a long period of time. They will often find it difficult to think ahead in time, to demonstrate future time perspective. And it's also fair to say that while not the entire sort of picture, pharmacotherapies, Alcoholics Anonymous all fit with this theory, this idea that what happens when you become addicted is that your ability to exercise inhibitory control has become impaired. That's one of the problems, and it's something that happens over a period of time. I want to say something about psychostimulant drugs because in this context of inhibitory dysregulation, psychostimulants have a particular effect in this regard on the brain. The chronic effects of psychostimulant drugs, and actually they're not particularly well understood, and so this would include drugs like cocaine or methamphetamine, amphetamines and so on. People very often aren't aware, even clinicians aren't aware of some of the particularly physically damaging effects that psychostimulant drugs can have on the body. Shane Darke is a professor who works over in the University of New South Wales in Australia, has done a lot of work looking at drug-related deaths and overdoses, and has published work talking about the effects of psychostimulants. And one of the effects, other than the effect on the brain, is the effect on the heart. The heart age for people who have been using psychostimulant drugs for many years, the age of their heart will be way in advance of the age of their body, because of course taking stimulant drugs puts massive strain on the heart, and it will age your heart quite significantly, and so there can often be drug-related deaths and so on associated with that kind of unseen and unchecked damage to the circulatory system. Now, the other effect, though, of psychostimulants on the brain is the effect that they have on neurons in the brain. So the diagram just here on this slide illustrates the short-term and the long-term effects of psychostimulant use. What this does is lead to, because of the chronic depletion of monoamines in the brain, it leads to this necrosis, apoptosis and arborization of neurons. So the neuron on the left of the picture here is showing just a normal neuron with the axon terminals and the dendrites and so on. What happens in the short term is that those connections are broken effectively. Arborization is the process by which they will grow back, and there's work showing that when people stop using psychostimulants, the effect, the neurological damage that's caused by psychostimulants to these parts of the brain, and particularly the parts of the brain associated with inhibitory control, that will recover, but it can take maybe 18 months or so from the point that a person quits for that arborization process whereby the brain effectively tries to repair itself. The important thing is with the brain, when there is any damage caused, it can repair itself, but it won't make itself kind of look the same way as it did before, hence the long-term picture on the right there showing connections growing back in different places. What this leads to, this effect on these parts of the brain, are a range of different deficits that are present in people who are long-term psychostimulant users that include things like difficulties with verbal and working memory, attention, speed of processing and various other executive functions, and also some evidence of psychomotor, so physical movement deficits. Again, that's quite important in terms of thinking about recovery. If we know that the use of these drugs over a long period of time is going to lead to deficits in these cognitive processes, that's going to be pertinent to someone's recovery, because verbal and working memory, executive function are all things that are going to be important in the context of, say, psychosocial talk-based therapy, sitting and reflecting and thinking about your drug use, thinking about how you're going to address it, thinking about strategies for dealing with high-risk situations where you might be at risk of relapse, planning ahead. All of these things require these sorts of cognitive processes, which is really quite key. And so understanding that in the short term for a person, particularly for people who have been having problems with psychostimulant use, understanding that these sorts of this form of damage takes place to the brain and will recover, but will not recover very, very quickly, is very important in terms of thinking about the kind of support that individuals may need. And the last thing really I wanted to mention on impulse control more generally is that, aside from the fact that, from the work that Lubman and his colleagues did looking at this literature, that was very much looking at the evidence for individuals who have these problems. So for a person who has developed a problem with drugs or alcohol, it seems that this inhibitory dysregulation takes place, and it appears as though it's likely to be as the result of chronic use of the drugs. Now it becomes a little bit chicken and egg, because we could beg the question, well, okay, so that's fine, but are people actually, is it the case that people with addictions have poor inhibitory control to begin with? Or is this inhibitory dysregulation something that is a consequence of addiction as opposed to being a cause? Now, there is evidence, and this is summarised in a paper by Nora Volkov and colleagues reviewing what we're going to come on to in a moment, which is the brain disease model of addiction. We do know that people who are high in trait impulsivity, so from a personality measure perspective, people who have high traits, score highly on measures of impulsivity, as well as novelty seeking, so individuals who like doing new things, who enjoy novel experiences, that is likely to predict, it seems to predict later life addiction and substance misuse. So amongst adolescents who are high in impulsivity and novelty seeking, that seems to predict an increased chance of them developing a problem with drugs or alcohol. The problem with that is that it's not specific. And by specific, I mean that it's not the case that anybody who has a high degree of impulsivity and novelty seeking will definitely become addicted to something later on in life. It can also be associated with other negative behaviours like crime, for example, engagement in criminal or antisocial behaviour. For people who are high in impulsivity as a personality trait, and these traits, as you know, will vary from person to person on a sliding scale, just like height. People are more or less impulsive, more or less novelty seeking. At the extremes, some people are extremely impulsive and other people will be extremely restrained and not at all impulsive and very considered in their behaviour. And also for novelty seeking, some people will really love doing anything new, any sort of new experiences, it really kind of excites them. For other people, it's really threatening, it's the complete opposite at the other extreme. Some people really just dislike any new experiences. They prefer things to stay the same. They like to have regularity and routine in their lives. And then, of course, between these 2 points for both traits of impulsivity and novelty seeking, there's kind of every shade of grey in between. But the important thing is that this isn't something that predicts definitively that you will develop a problem with drugs or alcohol later in life. It's not specific. It can be a risk factor for other things. But a person who scores highly for impulsivity and novelty seeking may well also really enjoy doing things like, whitewater rafting, doing something that requires you to just, not worry so much about the risks, throw yourself into a new and exciting situation. So, aside from some of the negative consequences of being impulsive and having high novelty seeking, as a pre-existing characteristic, that's not something that we can use practically. It has no real practical value. We can't go around screening young children and saying you're high in impulsivity and novelty seeking, therefore you're going to develop a problem with addiction, and we're going to try and stop that from happening. So that's quite important, that in terms of whether or not impulse control issues have an impact on the later development of addiction, it seems to increase your chances, but not in a way that is usefully predictive, not in a way that is so kind of strongly connected that we could actually, identify people who are going to develop addiction problems before they do. So I now want to talk a bit more about disease models of addiction. And disease models of addiction are quite important from the perspective of sort of impulse and self-control theories. If we are understanding addiction as a problem of impulsiveness or a difficulty in exercising control, it's a really important question to kind of come down to this sort of very fundamental theoretical level as to whether or not we think addiction is a disease. Is addiction something that people have that is comparable to, say, a condition like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's? Is it associated with changes which are themselves pathological? Do they have an etiology that is well understood, and that means that a person cannot control their behaviour, they cannot exercise impulse control, that they are unable to self-regulate? And so understanding whether addiction is a disease is quite important, but it's not at all straightforward. I just want to say a few things about disease in general, understanding what we mean by disease from a broad medical perspective for any type of disease, not just addiction, not just mental health. What do we think a disease is? Now, there's a definition here that tries to make or draw a distinction between health and illness. To understand disease, Boers argued here, or stated here, it's a traditional axiom of medicine that health is the absence of disease. Okay, we can probably all agree with that. It's not particularly helpful. It's just simply saying that one thing is the absence of another. So it begs the question, well, then what is health? If health is an absence of disease, then what is a disease? The analysis I wish to offer is that health is normal functioning, where the normality is statistical and the functions biological. That's a really interesting and quite reductionist perspective in terms of understanding what disease is. What we're saying here, or Boers is saying here, is that a disease is always biomedical in origin. That if a person has a disease, then that disease has to fundamentally and primarily be caused by a biomedical dysfunction. And in terms of understanding what we mean by what's a dysfunction as from a biological perspective, it's this idea that it's a non-statistically normal functioning. So taking, for example, having the flu. If you have the flu, then your body is going to be reacting to the presence of a virus, which is not normal. Statistically speaking, you would be an outlier because most of the population don't have the flu. You may have a high temperature and so on and so forth. That temperature is then statistically non-normal. It's something that is a deviation from ordinary function of the body. And fundamentally, having something like the flu is very clearly a biological problem, first and foremost. In terms of your recovery and how quickly you get over it, then social factors can play a role, whether you have access to medical care, whether you have access to support, you're able to take time off work, do you have the resources and the means to be able to miss time from work if you're in a position where maybe you don't get sick pay and so on. So there are kind of broader factors that influence the course of recovery from a condition like the flu, but we nonetheless accept that the flu is first and foremost a biological disease, that you have an illness, we understand the cause, and that we know that that is a deviation from what's normal. So what Borse is arguing is that this statistical deviation is a deviation from the population's functioning. It's a matter of biological difference. The fact that you have this disease is because your biology is fundamentally different to the normal biology of the rest of the population. And what Borse was also trying to do in establishing, this was back in the 70s, this particular definition of disease, is what he hoped was a non-evaluative judgment. That by saying somebody has a disease, you're not making a judgment about whether they're a good or a bad person. You're simply making a value-free statement about the presence or absence of this biological dysfunction. Now, this view is, I've just given the example of flu, but you could take bubonic plague, cancer, or indeed coronavirus, COVID-19. This is relatively uncontentious for defining these sorts of diseases. They very clearly have well understood biological mechanisms which, if they happen, will cause the illness, and we understand why. We don't necessarily always know how to treat them, but we know that in principle they could, and we do research to try to understand how we can treat and prevent these problems. They're a statistically non-normal state. Statistically, it's not normal in the sense of being, kind of the average, to have something like cancer or plague or influenza. And there's no need, arguably, to invoke a value judgment if a person has any of these sorts of illnesses. But are we happy with this view in the context of mental health, and particularly this question about value judgments? Thomas Szasz, who's written prolifically on this particular subject, has made this point that mental health and illness has long stirred controversy in terms of how we think about it, in terms of how clearly we are able to define the presence or absence of mental health or mental illness. And I like this particular quote from his 1970s text. If you talk to God, you're praying. If God talks to you, you have schizophrenia. If the dead talk to you, you're a spiritualist. If you talk to the dead, you're a schizophrenic. What Szasz is drawing attention to here are some of the cultural differences that exist in terms of how we understand and talk about disease, and mental health in particular. That these things can be very culturally dependent, that certain behaviours that in one country may be considered completely normal may be classed as being an illness in another, which really belies this idea that diseases in a mental health context can be understood meaningfully, first and foremost, as biological dysfunctions that deviate from the norm. And it's also the case that labels of disease, regardless of what Borse may have been trying to argue, have always been seen as ways of stigmatising individuals. It leads to practices of institutionalisation, enforced treatment of the sick, people who we've identified at a social level as having had some problem or illness. And so this idea that you can disaggregate a label of illness from any value judgment about the individual is a nice idea, but in practice it's not what happens. And Agic in a 1980s paper argued that actually any conceptualisation of a disease is a form of value judgment, regardless of whether we want it to or not. It simply is, and that actually it's important that we acknowledge that. It's important that we understand that and deal with it appropriately. And on this basis, disease is seen as being more than just biological, with implications for treatment. And this particular quote here from the 1983 paper, the disease explanation furthermore indicates what should be done. The language of disease thus should ideally be predictive in a way that is therapeutically efficacious. Description of functional processes alone will not always secure that. And what Agic was trying to get at here is that actually, if we want to understand what diseases are, if we want to talk about disease in a meaningful way, then surely the most meaningful way and the important way of doing that is to ensure that we talk about what the treatment should be. That by having a definition of something as a disease, that should fundamentally tell us how we deal with it, how we actually treat it. Now, it doesn't mean to say that by having a definition of something as a disease that we necessarily always then know how to do it. It may well be that our current technology or understanding is simply not as it should, and cancer would be a really good example of that, where as each year goes by we have more and more treatments available for various types of cancer. It sadly remains the case that there are certain types of cancer which simply can't be treated right now, and work goes on to continue to be able to treat them. But nonetheless, the disease definition of cancer, understanding and defining cancer as a disease with a biological origin, understanding the causes and the progress and so on of the illness, means that we have an understanding about where to look for treatments. We understand from a preventative perspective that lowering exposure to tobacco, lowering the rates of tobacco use amongst the population will significantly reduce the rates of lung cancer. So because we understand the biological origin of the disease, we can understand preventatively how to stop it happening, but we can also better understand how to treat it even if it still does happen. And so what does that mean from an addictions perspective? Is that actually a useful perspective from an addictions perspective? Is addiction actually a disease? Let's think about the issues. Bors's perspective is that diseases are deviations from normal functioning. So it's fair to say that a person who develops a problem with addiction has deviated from normal functioning if you assume that normal function is simply statistical. Yeah, so on average, statistically speaking, most people aren't addicted to alcohol. So therefore, anyone who is a statistical deviation. But Bors also argues that diseases are organic in nature. And importantly here, and just a caveat, is that just because we don't currently understand the biological origin of something, that's not sufficient to reject that there is a biological cause. There are many areas, as I've already mentioned, of, and even down to some of the sort of biomedical aspects of understanding the development and cause of certain types of cancer. We know that they're biological in origin. We just don't quite know exactly what those biological origins yet are. And research continues and productively continues to be able to further understand the biomedical processes that underpin the development of a variety of different cancers and other illnesses. Parkinson's and Alzheimer's would be other examples in that respect. But is it okay for us to assume that addiction is biological in nature or organic in nature, or primarily caused by a non-normal, statistically speaking, a non-normal disease state which is biological in origin? From this sort of Agic and Zaz perspective, disease isn't just a statistical deviation, it's a condition judged to be deviant in a negative sense. That in order to decide whether or not addiction is a disease, the implication would then be that we need to decide whether or not it's something that causes problems. And actually, is that true? Well, if we look at the definitions of that used by the DSM, for example, there's this idea that addictions have an impact on other people, or other people have expressed concern about your use of drugs or alcohol. And so it's certainly the case that embedded in our definitions and diagnostic approaches, that we do certainly take account of the experiences of other people. The idea of continued use despite obvious harm, that we've decided that harm is being caused and we've decided that harm isn't acceptable. So there certainly appears to be a social element to the way in which we define addiction from a disease perspective. And importantly also from the Agic and Zaz perspective, diseases are not simply organic changes in function, it's more than that. But this does beg an important question, a difficult question, about whether or not addiction should be thought of as a disease, and specifically whether it should be thought of as a brain disease. Now, before I move on to the brain disease model of addiction, which is a formalisation of this idea that not only is addiction as a disease, because actually, given what I've just said about the lack of clarity even in medicine more broadly about exactly what does the word disease mean, we could well say, well, look, we'll call addiction a disease, we'll say it's a disease, but actually maybe it's not just biological, maybe it's lots of different things, maybe it's social and spiritual and psychological and so on and so forth, as well as being physiological and neurological and whatever. We could just say, yes, it's a form of disease. It clearly is, for many people, it's suffering, being caused problems by addiction. It sort of seems almost semantic. It's a semantic argument about whether or not it's a disease. Jelinek wrote this text, The Disease Concept of Alcoholism, back in the 1960s. And this was an attempt to try to classify different types of drinker, because for alcohol use in particular, more so than probably many other types of drugs or addictive behaviours, presents itself in really quite significantly different ways between different people. And the four main categories that Jelinek identified, the alpha, beta, and then the gamma and delta alcoholics, as he phrased them, were defined in the case of alpha alcoholics as those who are psychologically dependent but not physically. So people that might in current terminology be described as being hazardous, harmful, or possibly even mildly dependent, but not people who experience loss of control. Their consequences are mainly social. People that have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, who maybe get themselves into a bit of difficulty, whether it's through hangovers or whatever it may be, but aren't physiologically dependent, but are experiencing psychological dependence. The beta alcoholics weren't dependent but experienced physical harms nonetheless. The harms related to environmental affordance, to unsafe drinking, rather than there being an underlying disease state. As you move on to the gamma and the delta alcoholics, the gamma alcoholics in Jelinek's terms were people with acquired tolerance to alcohol, so they've drunk so much that they can now drink quite large amounts of alcohol and demonstrate a high degree of tolerance. They experience withdrawal and craving and have a loss of control. And then the delta alcoholics was at the more extreme end, individuals where there was a loss of control that was replaced by an inability to abstain. So an inability to stop drinking, daily drinkers, people who weren't able to go a couple of days without drinking. Gamma alcoholics may experience a loss of control, but that could be more after having a drink. So they may go for a significant period of time even. In some cases, maybe a sort of a full midweek not drinking, but when they start drinking, they won't be able to stop. Whereas the delta alcoholics would usually be what we might describe as daily drinkers, people who feel that they get up in the morning and have to keep drinking, so quite severely alcohol dependent. And then there was this fifth category, although it's sort of slightly less well used and recognised, of epsilon alcoholics, which is probably what we'd call binge drinkers in today's language. Now, whether or not this particular conceptualisation is useful is up for debate. I think what's particularly problematic in the context of alcohol use, and I'd refer back to the work that I've previously described on problem recognition, is that the very term alcoholic can be really problematic for some people. As a self-identifying label, less so, but as a label that people are given, being told if you have a problem with alcohol, you're an alcoholic, can be really aversive and off-putting to some people who don't want to see themselves in that very binary sense of being an alcoholic, of having to accept this alcoholic identity. Again, for some people that can be really liberating, having a label they can put to the problem they've been experiencing and understand it as a disease, understand it as a condition that they've got that they can now deal with. For some people that can be quite useful, but for other people it can be really quite problematic. They can avoid recognising they've got a problem because they're being told that if they do recognise the problem, they have to accept this label of I'm an alcoholic. And the very fact that those different sorts of people exist really gives the lie to the problem of the disease model, that actually if different people can think of it in different ways but experience or to take something like being an alcoholic and experience very different reactions to it, it begs the question as to how meaningful this is and to what extent it's essentially just a social construct. It's just a label that we have invented that some people find useful and some people don't. But the idea of being an alcoholic, of having alcoholism as a disease, an underlying biological disease, is less clear. Now, importantly, any disease model, any type of disease model of addiction, whether it's Jelinek's work, whether it's something more generic, or the brain disease model, which I'll say something about momentarily, any disease model of addiction removes the notion of addiction as choice. And people that are advocates of disease models will very often point to this as being an important reason as to why we should think of addiction as a disease, because the idea that it's not a choice is construed as being an alternative to what's described as the moral model. The moral model of addiction simply implying that if you've got a problem with drugs or alcohol, it's because of a weakness of character. You're a bad person and that's why you have a problem. And so because we don't want to return to that way of thinking, that if people have problems of addiction, we feel they should be treated and supported and treated respectfully and given their dignity, or certainly not had their dignity taken away in the first place rather than it being given back. There's this idea that having the disease is the thing that controls your behaviour. And disease models claim that addiction is a disease state with a knowable underlying pathology. And I put knowable in inverted commas there because it's important to make the point that just because we don't yet know it doesn't mean to say that we won't at some point in the future. So simply saying, well, unless you can point to the part of the brain that has become diseased, that disproves a disease model would be an overstatement. And this also provides a framework for understanding the role of neuroanatomical factors, and our knowledge and understanding of the way the brain functions in psychology in general and in neuroscience and addiction more specifically is growing all of the time. And so disease models can be quite attractive and have been very attractive and very impactful, and particularly in the context of what we call the brain disease model of addiction. Now, the brain disease model of addiction has been around for a number of years now and is very influential and accepted in many countries and by many academics and researchers and clinicians as being a definitive way and the central way in which we should understand addiction. But there are people, and I'll come to some of the arguments in a moment, there are many people, many experts working in the field that feel that this is a massive overstatement. This is a really problematic medicalisation of a problem that is more than just a medical problem. Leshner argued in 1997 that addiction is a brain disease and it matters. He argued that the rejection of a disease model is wrong. He saw people that oppose disease models as taking the wrong approach, and that they would effectively see in or shepherd in the return to a moral model where if it's not a disease, it means that you've chosen to do it and therefore it's your fault. He suggested that a lot of the resistance to the model is based upon biased views in the addictions field, and it's certainly the case across the addictions field that many people have their own personal experiences, direct and indirect, whether it's themselves or their family members, who then apply this lens to understand addiction based upon their own personal experiences. And of course, that's not very good science. It's not very good science to say that I experienced a loss of control, or I've observed somebody else who has lost control, and because I've observed that, I don't want to think that that person had any control, and so therefore I think it's a disease. That's not science. That's anecdote or introspection in the case of taking on board your own personal views. He highlighted, though, that like it or not, some medical treatments do work, and that's certainly the case. But we've also seen in the sessions on learning theory that contingency management is a very effective way of both as a primary and also as an adjunct treatment to improve outcomes for various other types of interventions. That medical treatments do work, but of course, much more widely used are the psychosocial interventions. Now, again, that's a sort of this argument that he makes that medical treatments do work is a bit of a red herring. Just because something non-medical helps to fix a medical problem, as it were, or non-biomedical helps to fix a biomedical problem, doesn't mean to say that the problem isn't biomedical in the first place. The idea that if, for example, exercise and sporting activities have been shown to improve outcomes for people who are experiencing depression, that doesn't mean to say that depression is caused by an absence of sport. It's a logical fallacy to connect these two things, to say that the problem and the treatment always have to be consistent with one another. And he also discusses in this paper other moralistic perspectives, particularly this idea that we need to sort of protect people with addiction by using the brain disease label as a way to protect them from this judgment they may otherwise experience. In this particular paper, which was written in, I think, 2016, Volkov, Koob and McClellan, three very, very eminent researchers in the addictions field, wrote a review paper of the brain disease model of addiction. And here in this image, they kind of summarise what the addiction process is in terms of the things that happen in the brain, around the stages of addiction, binge and intoxication, followed by withdrawal and negative effect, which is followed then by preoccupation and anticipation. They're identifying in the brain here the parts of the brain that are associated with the development of those different things. Why people, what the effect of binging and becoming intoxicated is. What does that do to the brain? What then happens when you start to become more tolerant and experience withdrawal? How is it and why is it that you start to become preoccupied and anticipate the effects of using drugs or alcohol over a period of time? So they've identified in the brain all of the different processes, and they present a strong case for what they see as being the adequacy and success of the brain disease model. They claim demonstrable impacts on prevention, treatment and public health policy. And in the paper they discuss some of the reasons why this brain disease model has been maligned, or why many people still dispute its adequacy. One of the reasons that it's disputed is that it ignores the role of personal empowerment in recovery. So this idea that addiction is a brain disease, that there is fundamentally something that goes wrong in your brain, and when it goes wrong in your brain, that's when you become addicted. That kind of overlooks the fact that for many people in their recovery, the recovery stories that people will tell, that they've written about, that you can listen to, it's never about a kind of a sort of a sudden change in their brain. It's about being made to feel as though change is possible. That attending, a 12-step fellowship group, for example, finding someone who becomes your sponsor, a person who has been through recovery themselves or is in recovery themselves and can help and guide you towards your own path to recovery. This kind of role of personal empowerment is almost kind of diminished by this idea that it's a brain disease, that addiction is caused by a brain disease. But also importantly, actually, it's important to say that the specific neural changes that are highlighted in that particular paper and many others written by advocates of the brain disease model, there is actually a lack of evidence showing specific neural changes in the brain. Saying that a person becomes preoccupied by things that lead to reward is simply describing what the reward pathways do. So in order to demonstrate that addiction is not just a disease, but specifically a brain disease, it's incumbent upon people who want to advocate for the brain disease model to show us what the brain of an addict looks like, and not just in terms of activity in different regions of the brain and excitement and anticipatory mechanisms in the brain when presented with drug-related stimuli, for example. There needs to be an actual demonstration of what is that. Could you scan the brain of somebody who you know nothing about the clinical history of and make a diagnosis of addiction? The answer is no, you couldn't. There isn't actually evidence yet showing specific neural changes in the brain of people with addiction, which are pathological changes that don't exist in the brains of other people. It also ignores this, what Mark Lewis describes as the trajectory of addiction. And Mark Lewis describes it, I think, particularly persuasively, and Mark's also a neuroscientist, and so understands the neurological evidence and interprets the evidence in a different way to Volkov, Koob and McClellan and other colleagues. And he talks about addiction as being much more developmental, that we need to understand and we need to recognise the fact that addiction is something that happens slowly for many people. It happens over a long period of time, and recovery can equally happen in that same way. And that at no point from Lewis's perspective, and this is summarised in a paper written by several colleagues in 2018, presenting various alternatives to the brain disease model, Mark Lewis makes a real strong case for saying that if you look at what's happening for a person who goes into and has a period of being addicted and then comes out of that and lives through recovery, that at no point was there really a brain dysfunction, a brain disease, an identifiable point where you could say, here, that person's brain now has a disease. It's not to say that changes didn't happen in the brain, it's not to say the brain plays no role in addiction, but actually his point is that by distilling it down to being a primarily biological problem, you miss this whole much broader developmental social trajectory that's really important for understanding at an individual level what their addiction is all about. So what have we learned in this session? We covered quite a lot of content. We began by thinking through some of the implications and constraints, I guess, of self-regulation. Thinking from a normative psychological perspective, what self-regulation really is, what does it mean to exercise self-regulatory control. And we then applied some of that thinking to addictive behaviours, and particularly thought about what that might mean for recovery and what it might mean to exercise self-regulatory control to maintain abstinence. We also looked at the specific model of inhibitory dysregulation, which tells us something about some of the brain changes that can occur, some of the damage that can actually occur to the brain that can make it more difficult to exercise control over one's behaviour once addicted to certain types of substances. And importantly, what we highlighted there was that while things like impulsivity and impulse control are important, when a person's addicted, it's not the case that they lose those capacities entirely. And it's also not the case that if you are an impulsive person, that you are destined to definitely develop problems with addiction. So impulsivity is really important to understand some of the characteristics of addictive behaviour and some of the factors which could potentially predict addiction in the future. But it's also important to recognise the limitations of that impulsivity and impulse control and inhibitory dysregulation are not in and of themselves definitive characteristics of addiction. They are not things that cause it and cause it specifically and all the time. They're things that are associated with it. So they're important, but they're not central to understanding the entirety of addictive behaviour. We then discussed disease models in general terms, and specifically then the brain disease model of addiction as ways of understanding addictive behaviour, both either in general terms as a disease, which I concluded is maybe in and of itself less problematic, given actually how broad some of the definitions of addiction in medical literature, the medical literature are anyway. But also then looked at the brain disease model, which is a very specific and definite statement that addiction is first and foremost biomedical in origin. And without going into massive detail, because that's a really big area to look more into, what we highlighted was the fact that there are many people who disagree with that view, that see that as an oversimplification and not rejecting the role of the brain, not saying that addiction is not about the brain at all, but trying to make the argument that actually addiction is more than just about brain disorder, that there are certain things that are going on in the brain. If we understand them, that may help us in terms of treatment and impacts on recovery and possibly even prevention. But the conclusion that addiction is fundamentally first and foremost a brain disease in which a person is unable to exercise control over their behaviour. For that perspective, at the moment, there simply isn't any evidence showing that. In fact, there's a lot of evidence showing the opposite.